Hey everybody, welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
What up, Rob? This is your friend, your lovable friend, Jackie. That's, if you couldn't guess, that was my sitcom intro.
That's pretty good.
I like that a lot. And it's me, Diana Perry Cruz. Hello.
Oh, should I say my name? Jackie McDonald.
Did you
Can
say
if you
your
want
name?
to.
I say Jackie, but not
okay.
Jackie McDonald. So I'm going to say Jackie
Well, I
McDonald.
decided to start adding that because,
Nobody knows who's married to Rob.
yeah, and also I want people to know our last names too.
Truth.
It's a good idea.
Okay.
Well, welcome. This is a podcast
Thank you.
about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, not a podcast about full names. But that's okay, because in behavior analysis, we do have full names. Every week on the show, we pick a topic,
Oh, wow.
and we
Do have full
Solid.
names.
discuss it at length.
Solid.
As through the lens of research article. Sorry, folks. We all just came back. This is like the second recording in a row where we all went and did some like busy thing right before related to
true.
the Cub Scouts, and we are all very tired from. We had a fun overnight activity that we all did. Which is fun, but at the same time, I don't think you realize how little sleep you get when you do one of these activities and these like overnight activities until you are trying to record a podcast like, a number of hours later. So, here we go. We're going to get back into it.
I'm jazzed. I can't tell you how jazzed
I'm
I am.
not unjazzed about the topic. I picked a very boring chore to do that I did for like 4 hours straight. So I'm going to get my mind in the
That's
podcast.
on you.
That's
Yeah,
on
that's
me.
totally on you.
I thought it was going to take 30 minutes. It did not.
No, you've been down here for like 4 hours.
Yes, it's a very long and boring task.
Yeah, I wondered what happened to you.
I went downstairs and I did a boring task where I'm trying to sort a very boring thing so I can
I
file
cleaned
it
up the
away.
living room and the kitchen and made the kids put the clothes away and made cookies.
Well, those clothes got folded by me.
Everyone is so excited about your schedule.
Yeah.
You forgot
They might be.
we're recording.
They might be.
That's true.
They might be. I don't know. Do we just restart this whole thing or just
No, we
turn
keep
it
it
into the
in.
skids? Turn it into the skids here.
Perfect.
Keep it in.
Yeah, all right.
Fact.
We're human. We're humans too, and we're going to be talking about respecting all humans for all of their differences today on this episode, where we're discussing ableism in schools.
Yay!
Yay to ableism in schools, Jackie? I'm shocked. I thought you'd save that.
Well,
That's the twist.
I'm excited that we're talking about
okay.
it. Not that it's
You're not,
happening.
you're not,
Right,
you're not
yeah.
excited
Yeah.
about ableism.
No, that's fair. Yeah. It's an important topic, and I'm glad we're talking about it too.
Yeah, well, I figured you would jump in because you have spoken a lot about this topic, not just podcast related, but a lot of presentation materials. I know it's something that professionally you've been very interested in. It's one of those terms that I sort of just lumped into the yes, these are types of discrimination, but I don't think I'd thought about it till I know you were sharing some slides. I was doing a presentation, and you said I did one similar to that, and I said I'd love to get some ideas, and so you shared some resources, and there's ableism, and I realized, man, we're not talking about this as much as we should be. So
true. So true.
Yeah,
Well, here we are. Pull
where
back
did
the curtain.
Where did you get into ableism? The topic of ableism, I should say, or discussing it.
Oh, that's a good question that I wasn't really prepared for, because I think that I've been looking at this type of research and folks' opinions on it for quite a while. And I probably got into it through varying social media groups or posts that I saw. And so I joined varying groups of folks who had different backgrounds, different perspectives, and read a lot of information. I did a lot of my own background reading and research. And then in the context of teaching, I teach a class where we spend a lot of time talking about the history of autism, disability rights, ableism, neurodiversity, and the social versus the medical model of disability. And so through that process, I think I ended up reading quite a bit about this topic, and I think it's really important. And certainly if folks are longtime listeners of the show, right, you can, I would think, see a shift in our focus and our perspectives over time. Because we've been doing this for
8 years.
X number of years. 8 years.
8 years.
Says Jackie. 8 years now, right? And so
It'll be 9 in February.
certainly my understanding of this topic and the way in which we might approach research and working in our field has grown and changed over that time, and our field has grown and changed over that time. So I don't think it would be surprising to anyone to hear that we've done this type of background work and reading through that time period.
I know that I became interested in this topic when I actually taught Diana's class. So I hadn't delved into it. I mean, I heard, that we were being ableist, but I didn't really understand what that meant until I had to teach it by teaching Diana's class alongside her. So I'm still learning, though. I learned a ton from these articles.
They're
Full
really
disclosure,
good, yeah.
I was so excited to read them, and I thought they were also well written, and they laid out the problem and the solutions better than most articles, I feel. So I was very, very impressed.
Cool.
So I have a confession to make.
Yes.
Here we go. So ableism as a form of discrimination is certainly one that I've always lumped into all the forms of discrimination. Bad, don't do that. That's awful. And in reading these articles, I found them very challenging in a number of ways to reflect on. Because unlike, I think we've talked a lot about forms of discrimination on the show over the years. And while having like hard conversations can be uncomfortable, they've certainly been in topics that do, at least, I'm going to speak for myself, due to my own privilege, I could sort of see as like, oh, well, that's something we're thinking about. We're talking about as a nation. Like I could distance myself from them to some extent, even when having those conversations. And I've learned a lot in that process. So I expected when we picked this topic, I'm reading the articles, this is going to be such an easy, because I've gotten so much better at talking about these. I don't feel that comfortable talking about ableism, because unlike I think some of our conversations where we're learning, we're still listening, this is a topic where some of the areas where these are ableist practices, it was like a slap in the face of, hey, and guess what? I'm describing something that you personally, as someone who taught as a special education teacher, still are in the field of special education, said, possibly are. And I found myself with a lot of here's some ideas, or here's some ways we could move away from that, really struggling with, but. Like I really butted so much of these articles. And, you've sort of got that, I don't know if you've had that in other topics, that sort of that dual mind of, I want to make the change. Yeah, but do I need to make? So I found this a very challenging topic to come to. And I really did not. I expected this to be, slam dunk. We've been talking about this. I'm so excited to be someone I think has really learned about so many of the injustices in the world, and a much more an ally to change and against those who wouldn't change. And man, this is the first time in a while, I think it just felt like, I don't know. Am I going to be as good talking about this, or am I going to be a barrier? I don't think I will be a barrier. Certainly, we're also just talking around a microphone, but it was a little scary to think about, oh man, I could be one of the people that I've been increasingly frustrated with in the world.
I can say I feel your point, because when I was reading the articles, I found myself reflected in many of the articles and what I have been writing and what I have been saying, and without even thinking, right? Because our language is embedded in our society. And I found that when looking at the history and why we talk about that and what that language might mean for, the autistic community and how it came about, I have found that I also need to do a lot of work in that area. So I felt you. I also felt that it was hard, but for me, it was a little more invigorating. Like, oh, look, I'm noticing something that I could be doing better at, and now I need to do better, right? And trying to think of like ways that I can do that while still working in the confines of my job and insurance companies, but in a way that can be affirming. So
yeah. And the good news is, to that respect, Jackie, I think that there is a lot of room that we have, right, to do exactly what you're saying. And then with respect to what you said, Rob, earlier in reference to something different, you were saying turn into the skid. But I actually think that is applicable here as well when we're having these hard types of conversations, because there is a point where whether it's this or some other bias, unconscious bias that you may find yourself carrying or kind of discover, you do actually have to turn into the skid. You have to be like, oh, that is something I've been thinking, or that is a way that I've been practicing. And I didn't mean to. It's just what I had learned in the past. And if you want to, I'm bad at driving on ice, but I'm pretty sure that that's what you do, right? You have to, if you're sliding on ice, you have to turn.
You turn into the skid.
Turn into the skid in order to right your car, right? So it isn't actually a very apt metaphor, because if you keep fighting against it and say, that's not me, I don't do those things, not my ABA, right, etc., then you're just going to make it worse. And if we as individuals and as a field want to get ourselves out of a potential skid, then we have to acknowledge what's going on, what maybe we've not been doing as well at in the past, so that we can actually kind of, right ourselves and get going in the way that we want to go.
So
how's that for a little segue?
It's a good
segue to what? What articles?
Probably the articles. No, it was a roundabout segue from the earlier thing. That's a callback.
Oh.
Yeah. Would you like to know the articles?
I'd love to.
Oh, okay, sure. Then we have three. I found a lot of articles, but we are going to attempt to focus our conversation more specifically to schools at this present moment in time, ableism in schools. There's a lot of good articles out there that we would like to cover in the future. But the three that we really want to focus on today are as follows: Combating Ableism in Schools by Story, published in Preventing School Failure back in 2007. Also, Recognizing Ableism in Educational Initiatives, Reading Between the Lines. That's by Timberlake, published in Research in Educational Policy and Management in 2020. And Avoiding Ableist Language, Suggestions for Autism Researchers by Batema Butel, Cap, Lester, Sasson, and Hand. And that was published in Autism in Adulthood, also 2020. Big year.
Big year. All right. So when we talk about ableism, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah. So I feel like the easiest way to describe ableism is thinking about discrimination against disability. And disability could be defined a lot of different ways. So it could be a physical disability, it could be an intellectual disability, or it could be, maybe an invisible disability, as we sometimes refer to, which could encompass all sorts of things, including having a different neurotype, such as autism, that may make it such that your interactions with the world are different than what the general population's expectation might be. And in the story article, they give us a definition from Rauscher and McClintock, and I'll tell you what that is. They said, quote, ableism is a pervasive system of discrimination and exclusion that oppresses people who have mental, emotional, and physical disabilities. These are deeply rooted beliefs and involve creating an environment that is often hostile to those whose physical, mental, cognitive, or sensory abilities fall out of the scope of what is currently defined as socially acceptable. So I think that my definition matches up pretty well with that, right? And so just like other isms, right, we have ableism, just like we have racism, just like we have, I was going to say misogynism, but I'm not sure that is actually a word, right? But we have ageism.
Well, it's a word, I guess.
Right? What word am I wanting to use when I talk about like gender discrimination?
I think you just say gender discrimination.
Oh, so it's not an ism. So that was a terrible example, but it still falls under the
is a concern as well.
Still falls underneath this same area, right? And so certainly when we think about discrimination based on race, for example, like that is pretty well understood within our society. And ableism is just as present as racism, ageism, genderism, etc. But it might not be part of our sort of general consciousness when we have conversations about these things. It's just as other isms are developed and maintained by society at large and the cultures that we live in. It doesn't require one individual person to say, hey, I don't like people with disabilities and I'm going to go out of my way to make sure their lives are harder, right? That is not required. It doesn't need to be some type of overt discrimination, but rather it is embedded and enmeshed within our understanding of how the world works, within how the world actually does work, because it hasn't been designed for people with disabilities. And even in the language that we speak, right? There, as Jackie's going to talk about that later, there are a lot of built-in components of our language that function as discrimination against people with disabilities. So these things are all just permeated within our society, and it doesn't require someone to consciously be acting in a discriminatory manner. Rather, it is just kind of baked in to the whole situation, right? So you don't have to say like, well, of course I'm not ableist. Like, I work with people with disabilities and I care about all the people that I work with. It may be the case, just as in past discussions we've had about race, let's say, right? That due to your own personal histories and your own personal upbringing and the fact that you live within a society that permeates and perpetuates these types of discriminations, that you may find yourself holding similar biases against people with disabilities without realizing it. And even if you are, don't want to be like that, right? Or haven't ever thought that you were doing that before, it is important to pause and reflect, to think, well, is that potentially the case for me or in some of my actions? And that's kind of like the first step that one might need to take in order to then be able to actively work against what may be the biases that you hold through no fault of your own, except the environment you were raised in.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. That's a really good review.
Thanks, guys.
Summary.
Okay.
I know one of the concepts that I kept coming back to in reading these articles, and we'll talk about it, more specifically in the Timberlake article, really comes down to how many of our structures are just built with the assumption of, well, this is for the normal people, and this is the best way to do things. Therefore, we'll make accommodations, I suppose. But there's almost this weird begrudging nature to like, well, we've created these things for the average person. And by average, I mean normal. And by normal, I mean they're able to walk without, assistive technology or with assistive devices, and they're able to communicate vocally, and they have an IQ of 100 or so, or 85 to 115, and maybe higher, but definitely not lower. And things should be made for this group because this is the main group. And if you're not in this group, well, that's unfortunate for you. And I guess we'll throw you a bone by maybe having some pictures or some ramps. And that's to help you, though, because you should have probably thought better about your disability before you had it. Or I don't know. It just feels like there's this weird concept that I don't think, unlike, certainly talking about racism and talking about systemic racism, there's a lot hidden there. But I think with disability and ableism, there's almost like a weird increased perniciousness to just the banality of the type of discrimination. It's just, well, that's just how it is, right?
Yeah.
Schools have to be this way. That's how they are. We wish
that's how it's always been.
Therefore, we wish we could do more, but that's just how it's going to be. Sorry, people with a disability. I don't know what to tell you. As opposed to saying, well, why does school have to be that way? Why do, roads and sidewalks have to be a certain way? Like, why do we have to build things that way? And then sort of just having people stare at you if you bring that question up, like, well, that's how we've always done it here.
Right. And when you say that's how we've always done it, it's because in the past, folks with disabilities had no voice, right? So people were institutionalized or who knows what, and didn't have the opportunity to have their positions in society experienced by anybody else because nobody saw them, right? So when you're saying, well, like, oh, like, sometimes there are ramps, like even those modifications had to be really hard fought for and won at great expense to the people who were attempting to get those, what we would view as basic equal rights and availabilities open to them. So you're absolutely right that it's been a hidden group that hasn't really been able to get the same experiences that they would need to as other people for a whole variety of reasons. And in the story article, he put a quote in here from Gill, 1995, that I really liked. And the quote is, he's talking about non-disabled people. So he says they are so smug about the centrality of their experience. And that was just a great summary, I think, of what this whole ableist perspective is, right? Okay, so we talked about ableism generally, and I think we want to move ourselves into how we may see this present in schools specifically, right? Just like other isms, it's possible that teachers or administrators or folks who are in charge of designing our schools, school buildings, the curricula themselves, the assessments that are involved, the decisions about who is going to get what type of education, whether it's regular education or special education, or what type of supports they're going to get. Any of those folks are fallible, right? They're humans. They all have their own learning history, and it's possible that they may carry or harbor some perhaps unconscious ableist bias against groups with disabilities, whatever that disability might be. So, the story article talks about that there may be negative cultural assumptions about disability, negative stereotypes present, a lack of understanding about disability issues. So
That's
again,
huge.
It doesn't have to be pernicious, like you're saying,
Right.
but if you haven't had your own experience and your own learning related to disability, then you just may not know what you should be doing.
Right. And
Yeah.
one thing I'm going to pull this in, this is from the Bedelbaum. Is that how you say it? My article?
Botema butyl.
Butema, I can't say. I'm not great with, I always ask Diana for last names. Is that it makes sense from a language perspective that disabilities would fall under this ableist approach because many of the disabilities were discovered by medical doctors and by researchers, right? And they were labeled as a deficiency in what aired from the neurotypical or non-autistic population. And so right from the get-go, when they said, okay, you have this disability, they were automatically characterized as less than, right? Because of the language that was surrounded by it. And could you imagine how different our world would be if, like, say, in the 40s, when the researchers discovered the characteristic of autism, they said, oh, this is a superpower. How different our language would be based on how those researchers described it then, and how easier it might be for people if it was described initially as a strength instead of a weakness.
Yeah. And not everyone feels as though autism is a superpower, and it's quite varied,
it
right?
is.
So,
but I'm just talking about
the hypothetical mind experiment. If they'd said, "This is so different. This must be a new evolution of
right,
the human mind,"
like another way to be,
another way to be,
Period.
and just imagining if it had started there instead of started at a place from deficiencies. And difference.
And I think that it might be good for us to do a whole episode talking about the medical model of disability, et cetera. But I also wanted to note in the story article, I see changes in, I think, how we think about things now versus that article then, because that was in 2007. And in that article, they were talking about why we want to work on, like, quote unquote, eliminating stereotypes. And I feel like we've kind of moved past that type of language in our discussions here. So, previously we've talked about the difference between cultural competence and cultural responsiveness, right? And with cultural competence, it's the basic idea there is that I can learn everything about other cultures. And once I know everything about that culture, I'll know how to interact with them. But you really, truly cannot know about somebody else's culture because you can only truly know what your own experience has been. So you only can come from your own individual perspective. So cultural responsiveness or cultural humility is about, basically, honestly, it's about understanding that fact first and foremost, and always bearing in mind that, what my personal cultural background is individual to me, and the person who I'm interacting with, their background is going to be individual to them. And my best bet here to bridge that gap is to be open, honest, listening, and finding out what's important to them in order to have us interact in a way that's meaningful for both of us. So I feel like that same exact model is applicable here too, right? So like eliminating stereotypes, like that's really pie in the sky and
That's never going to happen.
It just doesn't have to do with the real life,
right?
And
it's not going to happen, right? Because we all engage in like unconscious stereotyping of people based on our history of reinforcement and punishment, right? So that's just a thing that's going to happen, right? Because we're people and we're human, but that doesn't mean that we can't also be responsive to difference.
Still, to some extent, I feel like when we talk about getting rid of stereotypes, we're also talking about we need to change people's verbal behavior around a subject rather than looking at, root causes of stereotype or how does one's impression of otherness impact their interest in changing policy or increasing access to resources.
Yeah. It's almost like I don't see color type of phrasing, right? Which
therefore
I also
I'm done.
Hope
which is ridiculous.
Have moved past as well. So understanding like my perspective of how I operate in the world and what supports I may or may not need in order to do the things I want to do in my life is individual to me, and I can't fully know what someone else's experience is like without interacting with them, asking them, and observing what that experience is.
For them.
Yeah. Exactly. I don't know. I forgot what else I was going to say regarding that point. So.
I know. I think that's great. Something that you said, though, I've been thinking about this all day, and I'm wondering if merely changing our verbal behavior might then change society's view on things, right? Because how we're talking about something may then change how we're talking about something to someone else, may then change the perception. I don't know.
Possibly.
I think that would be a really cool research critical.
We then sort of get into, does changing one's verbal behavior change it in terms of like your frames around, either or, some of those versus I just understand what audiences I can be a real jerk. I can talk about these like things obnoxiously, and I know that they'll reinforce that stereotypical language, and the ones I need to be nicer around or I need to not use that language.
Well, sure, but
I don't think so.
I don't think so either, because I'm really thinking like if I change how I'm discussing needs, for instance, how we're talking about being anti-ableist, right? If I'm talking about specific needs and not talking about special ed, and I'm not talking about the symptoms of autism, but the specific supports that the student needs in order to be successful in the classroom, will then that change the verbal behavior or the actions of others, the listener, right, due to the history now of contacting reinforcement through my language? I don't know. I just think it would be a really cool dissertation, probably not a master's
I'd be curious.
thesis,
It might come down to sort of to like the motivation.
It might.
Where's the change coming from? I am changing because I want to, be a better ally, be a better advocate, work better with individuals in my care with disability.
Maybe versus your community.
My community is just like getting on my case, and it's like, fine, you want to use these new terms, I'll use them in front of you, but it's not going to change how, and
Well, that's still related to your past history,
right?
Then, and different cultures have different understandings of disability based on how the language is used within that culture and what the connotations are related to disability and even what words they have for disability. So I think that there is some truth to this.
I think I don't know any research looking at this, but my article highly suggests that just changing our language may then help to change the societal norms that we are experiencing now. So I just think that would be a fascinating research. And maybe if we can do something like, I don't know, in a small group and see what happens. But I don't know. It's shower thought.
I like it. I did remember the other thing I wanted to say related to this, so this was great. Because I was saying like, it's like a I don't see color type of idea, right? Which I think embedded within that is the idea that disability is a bad thing, right? It's coded as bad. And we want to get away from that. There's nothing wrong with disability. You can use the words disability. You can use the words disabled. And we want to understand what is someone else's experience, as much as they can tell us what that experience is like, right? So that we can identify what are going to be the supports that are helpful for them, what can we do to alter the environment, accommodate them, et cetera, so that they can experience the world in the way that they want to, in a way that is ultimately most fulfilling for them. So it's okay to use those words. We don't need to shy away from it, as Jackie's probably going to say as well. And to tie this into schools, like this is pervasive in schools. So
even the term special ed
yes,
is less than.
It's, special in some way, right? Which is like a, what's that word? Euphemism, right?
I don't
Is
know
that the right
words.
word, Rob?
Rob would know.
Yeah.
I don't know words like that.
It's like dancing around trying to say something. Right? Because you think it's a bad thing to say. That's the core of what's going on there. So schools, just like the psychological model, are kind of built in the same way, where if someone's not learning the way that you might anticipate, then they get kicked over to a special, quote unquote, special area, and additional testing, and then directions are taken to try to make assistance there.
But it still always comes back to, I think what we're talking about is when you're in special education, there's two kinds of special education teachers. You either are teaching individuals who they're never going to be doing the same things as our normal students. Therefore, give them their own scope and sequence, which to some extent, while I think that does come from some ableist assumptions about what everyone should be learning, it also does sort of allow for more individualization, which to some extent might be slightly more liberating of like, well, I don't care that you're not going to learn this thing because you don't seem to care and you seem interested in the following things. I'll help you learn those things, right? It's a little more person. It could be. I don't want to say it is. It could be more person derived. And the other type of special education is you're behind and my job is to catch you up, which again also points to why do they need to be caught up? Why doesn't the regular ed teacher just teach better? And I say that, and I know if you are someone who has
special ed teacher right now that's driving in their car, they're like slapping you through the radio.
It's a complicated issue.
It's very complicated because if you're a general education teacher, it is very hard to be like, well, you have to both teach children with and without disabilities, and depending on the intensity of that disability or how it impacts the thing that you have been told you need to teach, it does become like, well, now it is impossible. I can't teach, 20 children in 20 different ways. And that is true. And then that's a resource issue. But that comes back to sort of how do we want to envision education? How do we want to fund education? If we want to have more teachers, perhaps it would be so that we can group students by level of interest in topics rather than, well, you have special needs, therefore you need a special teacher with patience versus, a regular teacher, I guess, has no patience.
I think and often when you are having this type of hypothetical exercise that you're doing, you end up at the point of saying, well, why are we teaching the things that we teach to the general education students as well? Many of them are quite non-functional and aren't going to assist them in their day-to-day lives, right? So why is it that we're making that distinction too? If you have an intellectual disability, then we're going to teach you things that are functional in your life. And if you don't, then you got to learn trigonometry, which is quite useless. Unless you're going to build a bridge, maybe. Yes. I don't even know.
Well, I think we have a lot of educational systems, and then it's also hard to track, like, at what point are we just, well, you students aren't high achieving, therefore you shouldn't get to learn trigonometry, you should work on your tradesmanship. But again, there's a difference between helping individuals find the things they're passionate about so that they can continue learning what they want to learn throughout their life versus these are an arbitrary set of standards that I guess we have decided if you know all of the things, you therefore can excel in a very European, Western-centered capitalist society. So it goes beyond. I mean, I think the easiest way to deal with ableism would be to tear down a lot of the systems that we have in place. But that would be true about most of the isms.
You end up at a radical place when you go through this exercise, because it also, I think, is ableist as well to say, well, this person has a disability, and therefore we are not going to ask them to do these things that we're asking other people to do them. We're already making this assumption about them. That's not fair either, right? Either way, it has to be approached individually. Okay, so maybe I set some groundwork.
I think so. I think we have a sense of what the definition is. And one last thing is, and this was something that I sort of was kind of struggling with in terms of looking at solutions, is when we talk about ableism, we are talking about such a wide range of disabilities, some disabilities impacting an individual's ability to communicate their interests. So when we are talking about such a wide community, much of what we'll be discussing is sort of some general ideas and principles around sort of our language and possible directions to go in, but we're not we're not going to be able to speak for every single group for a number of reasons. Certainly there are many different disability types, but also because, that's not our story to tell. Well, let's take a little break, and then when we come back, let's look a little more directly at some of the ableist practices that exist in our kind of schools and research areas. We'll be right back.
Hi, do you want to be a BCBA, also known as a board certified behavior analyst?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts to get your graduate degree, just minutes outside of Boston.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education, dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years.
And our 2022 graduates had a 92% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy approved fieldwork placements, ethics mini handbooks, PhD levels professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland if interested.
And don't forget, our program is accredited by the Association of Behavior Analysis International, or ABAI, as a Tier 1 master's degree program.
Don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu.
regiscollege.edu.
One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there.
Bye.
And we are back talking about ableism in schools. And before we continue our conversation, I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. By listening, you're able to earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or you can click the link in your show notes to put in some key information for CEs. One of those pieces of information is going to be our code keywords. I'm going to give you the first one now. It's chai, C-H-A-I. It's the spice that they put in the tea to make chai tea.
But you know, chai actually means tea. So when you say chai tea, you're doing TT.
Yeah.
And I always do it, and I always giggle. TT!
So
Really, there's a lot of different spices
you just
in
say
chai.
chai.
That's not a spice.
Oh, chai's not a spice?
No.
Oh.
It's delicious.
It's a group of spices.
Yeah, it's got, I don't know, cinnamon, ginger, cardamom, black pepper.
Oh, I just thought it was like a thing that
It's so delicious.
went
The
in the
cardamom
tea.
is what makes it.
Okay.
But the code word is chai.
Yep, chai. All right. So we can't talk about ableism in schools without talking about various efforts to improve schools. And so we're going to be discussing the Timberlake 2020 article, which I think will leave everyone slightly frustrated in that it is an article of here's some ways to improve education. And what if every single one of those ways inherently was ableist? What fun. What a lot of work that lots of people put in to just continue to perpetuate discrimination. Yay! That's what you want to hear when you're done with a big project. Great job. You haven't accomplished anything, and things might be more discriminated than they were before. Jerk. You got to add the jerk to really just nail it in there.
Not Timberlake, though. This is a good article.
No, Timberlake's not saying you're a jerk.
And we're not saying they're a jerk.
I'm not saying anyone's a jerk. That's a hypothetical.
Okay.
You're a hypothetical jerk. So when we look at educational reforms, certainly there have always been educational reforms, and not all of them have resulted in just basic, change in terms of the purported outcome. But many of them also have had sort of downstream effects that were not either not planned for, not cared about, or were actually really thought well of, and it just still didn't work out. I mean, I think in like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I think they did funded a lot of research, and a lot of the programs that they were funding turned out to have pretty crummy results. So it's not like private equity can also screw this up. So since 1975, where we had IDEA, so there was a real legal requirement to educate all learners. There's always been the question of like, how do we improve the learning of all students? How do we create environments for high change? And one of the challenges that comes into looking for high and rigorous achievement is those terms tend to be very loaded to high and rigorous achievement for non-disabled individuals. And I guess it's okay if everyone also achieves high rigor, but it's not necessarily always the group that is of most interest, I think, to some of the policymakers creating these programs. Or they're not thinking hard enough about it to make sure that they're building systems and environments that allow for a high degree of growth for all learners. They're sort of thinking about it from a very much, we need the test scores to go up. So when we look at these initiatives, we have 3 that are discussed here. And I think these are kind of from a New York perspective, because I think Timberlake is a New York researcher.
Hey!
So
I was thinking, hey, where's my pie?
So there are a few examples here that
my pizza pie.
I naturally just tried to turn into what's the equivalent in Massachusetts. And sometimes there was a pretty good one-to-one correspondence. Sometimes there was not. But the 3 that he discusses are alternate assessments, which are part of No Child Left Behind, and from 2002, and then the reauthorization of IDEA in 2004, because there was a huge push of why are our students doing so bad when compared to other countries in a number of tests.
And we solved it.
And I don't think we did. No. And one of the pieces was, well, what if we tie funding for schools directly into these standardized tests, which pretty much all states have? And then the question says, but what about our students who don't really do well on tests for a number of reasons? Some of them could be they just struggle with tests, but a lot of it is going to be around, well, they have disabilities that make the taking of these computer tests very, very difficult, or they're not able to access as much of the content as it is taught. How are they supposed to demonstrate growth and knowledge? And the thought was, well, we have a great solution. They'll take some sort of an alternate assessment, which is usually some sort of a work portfolio. At least in Massachusetts, it's some sort of a work portfolio that's tied into the kind of educational frameworks and scope and sequence at the different grade levels. And so you create these modified activities that the student demonstrates proficiency with, and that demonstrates that they are being challenged to learn the same materials as their non-disabled peers. Okay, that sounds good, right? We don't want to leave out our disabled students with this test that they might fail because they're not used to taking tests, or that's not typically how they're assessed. So let's come up with an alternate assessment. Okay, right? That sounds good. The second initiative that Timberlake talks about are these scripted curricular modules. And I really wish he gave more examples. I sort of looked into some of Timberlake's other research, and he'd had some other articles about Engage New York, which I guess were these New York-based modules. Again, why I'm thinking he's a New York researcher, at least familiar with New York education, which is not, I think, the same as, because when I heard scripted modules, I was thinking like direct instruction modules. Like those don't seem, like those directly target all learners. Like they're I would consider them the least ableist curricula. So I think he's thinking more about just more sort of scripted, like what if I took the sort of inherently ableist curricula that exists and I scripted it more so teachers had to follow the same rules. So what if I took the teaching the teachers did and I took out the individualization or the options for individualization? So again, I think there's some districts that use these curricula. I know I've seen a number of them recently. And my first thought is, why are we using these? How are we supposed to use these? I hear a lot of like, I can't change them for any of the students. I have to do it as is. And so I'm thinking it's more those types of modules of like, here's a stock thing that you have to use. And I guess it's better than some things, but not necessarily what I would consider the best match for all students. But anyway, that's the second one. But again, if all teachers have the same material that they use for all students, then shouldn't all students do well regardless of their teacher? I guess, maybe. Let's see. And then finally, the third was project-based learning, which kind of felt like you just wanted to have 3. Because this one didn't really strike me as much.
She.
Oh, sorry, is she? I hear Timberlake, and I just think Justin.
I know.
That's what
This is Maria.
Oh no,
Maria.
The concert is ruined.
Yeah,
You ruined the concert, Rob.
Sorry, that's my bad.
he doesn't know what you're talking about.
So the third was project-based learning, which it felt like she just, rules of 3. We got to have a third one. So project-based learning, that's kind of bad, isn't it? I don't know. So that one didn't feel quite as unexpected consequences. That just seemed like nobody really liked this one. Spoiler for project-based learning. But again, the idea of if students are guided to study things of interest to them, then again, doesn't that make all education more accessible? Isn't that more individualized?
Tidbit. I did a class where I had a project-based learning opportunity when I was a senior in high school in New York. And I created, it was physics, and I made a canoe.
Did you like
a real canoe?
Did you find it to be helpful in terms of your knowledge of physics?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like really helpful. And the canoe floated, and I still have it. And I won't let my dad get rid of it. And it's so heavy. Just so you know.
Is it like out of a tree trunk?
It is out of...
Like a machoon?
No, I'm not that good.
Oh, okay.
It was out of plywood, but still.
Real cool.
You had to use
you
physics.
remembered it.
I remembered it, and I
Right.
won't ever let him get rid of it, even though it is the biggest thing I have ever. And I don't have it here because I have nowhere to put it.
But you're not like one time in school, I did some reading and then I wrote an essay.
Right. No, I used physics to create a canoe.
Yeah.
All right. So that's project-based learning.
All right.
And Timberlake had done other research on these three topics and sort of looked at what were the results of that research and how does it relate to a view of ableist practices, whether inadvertent or potentially directly ableist practices. And looking at those, you sort of see, the focus wasn't necessarily on like what was the average result from all of these areas, more by asking teachers about what did you think of this process or how did it go with the students, sort of looking for more thematic analyses around what did people think of them as initiatives and what language was used to describe them when talking about special education services and how did that or not demonstrate ableist kind of thought processes. So when you looked at questions, they'd have different ones. So like for the portfolio or the alternate assessment, you'd have, how did these change how you teach? Tell me a story about how this helped you teach in curricular modules. How are they working for students? Share an example. And again, for, project-based learning, what are some observations you've made about student responses to it, right? And so a lot of different questions for each of the different topics were the original studies. And surprise, since that's the point of the article, there were examples of ableism in all three studies and initiative. And a lot of it had to do with, again, like you talked about, Jackie, that medicalized perspective of disability as being a weakness. And we need to be focusing our education on how we fix those disabilities for the students. And a lot of real concepts about how the students, in order to access these ideally equitable practices, really just ended up with a lot of the students with disabilities being othered from the other groups. And again, a lot of language reflecting those kinds of ideals. She kept bringing up the term neoliberal emphasis, which I wasn't quite sure. I didn't quite understand how that fit into some of the topics because a lot of where she was seeing ableist language, I would consider more kind of associated with like some of the right-wing movements that we see in the country, unless it's sort of the neoliberal idea of like neoliberal would be someone who believes in progressivism, but only in the sense of their verbal behavior is progressive, but their actions continue to remain stuck in the past. But
maybe.
Yeah. But again, the idea that education is a commodity kind of came up a lot. With the alternate assessments, the teachers were kind of all just like, I don't know what to do. There's no way to teach everybody. And the students with disabilities are seen as disruptive. So I have to take them out of class and I have to teach them separately. And so now they don't get to be a part of the classroom anymore. And, they can't do most of the work. So both the teachers ended up both doing things that could have resulted in better access to education by more individualization. But there was also kind of a sense that the teachers were doing this out of a sense of, well, my students are different, therefore they have to learn differently and they can't do the same things as the other students. But I have to try to keep them up. But to do that, I have to take them away from their peers and I have to create, something different. So again, real otherness to the program and also devaluing. So not really thinking about it in terms of, why do they have to learn these things? Why should anyone have? Not why should they? Why should anyone have to learn some of these topics? Why is this an appropriate assessment of learning? Or are there other more appropriate assessments of learning versus, well, I have to do this thing and they can't do, the curriculum as written. So I guess I have to give them some other portfolio type work. So not really a sense of education is not working, but the students aren't working in the education system, and that's the way it's got to be. So the real otherness there. There was a phrase that one of the teachers said, we can't just dump them in regular classes where everything's over their head and they won't get anything out of it, which I think when I first heard that, I said, yes, of course. It doesn't make sense to make students who don't know how to do something just sit there and watch everyone else know how to do something. But then looking at Timberlake's response, that in itself, just saying that, although there might be some like anti-ableist sentiment there, it still really looks at the idea of like, well, why are you assuming the students, A, can't just do these things? Mm-hmm. B, why are you supporting a system where the expectation is if they can't do these things, there's something wrong with the student due to their disability? And then the one that I was a little less, okay, it works. The phrase of dumping them as seeing the students as being like objects. That one I was a little like, that feels like you're reaching a little bit there. But the first two really did make me think about how that is a phrase I have said.
Whenever you find yourself referring to a group of people as them, you probably want to pause that sentence and reflect.
The curricular modifications, again, I think I kind of mentioned, or I spoiled the lead in terms of all of the new programs really weren't made with the idea, how are we going to teach all of our students, so much as we just want to teach things in a way that like perhaps some of our students will better be able to access. And it rarely was going to be the students who had disabilities. A lot of teachers actually did feel that these programs were very equal because everyone got the same thing. But as we know, just giving everyone the exact same program doesn't result in equality so much as, I don't know. I don't even know what that would be referred to
that
as.
is equality, but it's not equity.
Okay.
Right? So equality would be, I think I'm getting this right, giving everyone the same thing, but equity would be giving everyone what they need.
So it's not equitable, but it is equal, but not equitable.
Yes.
Which is not helpful for a lot of people.
They should make up different terms because they sound too similar. So again, there's nothing about disability represented in the scripts, and for students who couldn't access the scripted content that way, well, SOL for you, students. So again, it really wasn't, these practices weren't ableist. So they might have been rigorous from some perspectives, but not for all perspectives for students. And they were really not looking at the value of the curriculum itself. So it was like you said, Diana, it might have been equal, but it was not equitable. And then finally, with project-based learning, it was more just a sense that everyone was kind of unclear as to what to do with them. Some teachers loved it, some didn't. Some felt that the students didn't know what to do. And this wasn't ableist. This was just all students. And then it came back to the idea of like when we talk about 21st century skills, that they are really based in this idea of, well, you need to have a job to have value, and you need to be able to enter the capitalist workplace in order to have value. And if you can't do that, then there's something wrong with you and you need to somehow be caught up. Versus the idea of, why do we have to be in the capitalist workplace? Why does our job where we sell things and how well we sell things relate to a value we have as a human being? So even though you might be setting up situations
Rob, fight the power.
for individualization much better with project-based learning, you're still coming at it from a perspective of, and your project better make money or somehow be something you can sell or a service you can trade or barter, which, they called a disconscious ableism here, which is a flawed awareness that allows that we can accept that the norms and privileges that come from our idea that normal is one thing and disabled is another, that's just how it's going to be. And so it's not necessarily an active process, but it is something where you are continuing to promote a script that is going to continue being othering for many people. So again, all these initiatives were kind of crappy when it comes to ableism because they all were built on an idea of some quote unquote normal learner and not really using this information to create equitable practice or individualized practice, because it always came from kind of this flawed root cause of everyone needs rigor. However, what rigor that's going to be is very much, well, it's going to be Western style testing. And even with project-based learning, it's like, well, you need to be able to enter the Western ideal of meaning. And if you can't do that, well, you're a burden to the rest of your poor teachers. Quote, your poor teachers. I don't feel bad.
You got
for the
some air
teachers
quotes going there.
I got some air quotes there.
I noticed in your notes too, you added another thing. Now I have to find it to say it correctly, but you had said, how do we feel about giving the student with Down syndrome the chance to make the field goal or the touchdown, right?
Yeah, there was a period, maybe it was like a decade ago, where like all the football teams, it seemed like every football team had that like, Rudy story where like, and one of the students with disability who never got to play in the game where the team was already up, or it didn't matter if they won or lost the game, they did like the special play, like the Billy play or whatever, whatever the student's name was. And everyone just took a knee and let the student walk across the touchdown, and there was cheering and applause.
Yeah.
And I hated those stories because it felt like, but I think I hate them for different reasons after really thinking about these articles than I did back then. It just felt like, well, you're not really allowing the student to play. You're just sort of putting them as a show, and they might not know that that's what's happening. And that just seems very like pat on the back of yourself and your normalness. And aren't you great because you took a day out of your normal game to allow them to be a part of something, which I'm sure they enjoyed, but also you're not really making them a part of your team. It's like a trick. It just seemed gross to me. And now I'm thinking it's even worse because, well, yeah, why do we have so many activities that are specifically set up for only certain people to be able to play? And, there's room for lots of different games. So why don't we have more games where people can really participate rather than just like carve out some sort of like showtime or some sort of televised time for just certain individuals, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to access the activity? I don't know. It's always seemed weird to me. But I also don't want to leave someone out if they're really happy about it. The individual disability. I also don't want to be like, well, you don't deserve to play as well. So it always felt like one of those complicated issues, which I wasn't going to talk about. It seemed a little outside of our topic, but you brought it up because I wrote it in the notes just to.
I brought it up because you put it in all caps there. So it seems that you were interested in grinding gears.
Oh, I just put things in all caps when it is like, this is all my thoughts. Like, I'm not actually, this is not like part of,
it was all caps.
Part of the notes of the article. Like if someone were looking at them.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, as people are maybe like trying to kind of sort through their own thoughts regarding ableism, like this might be one that came up for them as something that maybe always made them feel weird or what. And I think you're right. Like your initial thoughts are right? That you don't want to, it just feels icky. And it has a name. So I wanted to bring it up too, because it's called inspiration porn is what people call that. Because
Really?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know it had a name.
Yeah. So when you see those types of like feel good stories that are basically told at the expense of the person with the disability and makes everyone else around them look so great for allowing them this opportunity or supporting them, right? That is, like you said, like giving everybody else a pat on the back because it makes them feel good that they finally took the time to include this other person. That's what that's called. So you're right to feel weird about it. And we don't want to do that.
Oh, okay, good.
We want to meaningfully include people.
That's good. You always worry when you have a weird feeling about something. Like, is it a weird feeling because it's a me problem, or is this like a societal problem that I'm uncomfortable with?
It's a good question to ask.
Yeah.
It's a great question to ask.
Yeah.
Well, so I put it in all caps in my notes.
I mean, there's more content that we can cover in this one episode, which is only fair. So,
Okay.
we're moving on.
I think
We
so.
should move on, yeah.
Okay, it's me.
Yeah, you're
We're
up.
moving on to me. And so while my article is the Batima Boutel, I said it right, and colleagues. This is a more recent article, 2020, as we would say. And one thing that I really appreciate about this article is the introduction and how it places the value of language back from when, autism was first discovered, and places it very strictly into that medical model, which we talked about. And so I'm not going to really talk about the whole introduction, but I would love for people to read it because I found it really helpful. But one thing that these authors did is they gave you two things that I think are super helpful. The first thing is a series of 8 questions that you can ask yourself when it is for researchers, but I think that in schools you can ask this. You can ask these questions for yourself as well. And they say that as well. It's like, this is written for researchers, but obviously caregivers and teachers could use this too. So I want to just tell you these questions and you can think about them yourself. It's on page 8. So the first one is, would I use this language if I were in a conversation with an autistic person? That's a good thing to ask yourself. And number 2, does my language suggest that autistic people are inherently inferior to non-autistic people, or assert that they lack something fundamental to being human, which the research suggested in the 40s is because they were emotionless, right? And they weren't interacting in the same way, that they lost the essence of being human, which is horrible, but I can see the language now reflect that. So did I write that in a way?
Very deficit-based. The diagnosis is.
Yep. And here...
Sorry, I said that Yoda style.
You did. I like it. And I understood it, surprisingly. And so this is, number 3 is something that I need to work on as a professional is, does my language suggest that autism is something to be fixed, cured, controlled, or avoided? I don't feel those things, but my language is geared in that way. So I think I need to change my language in order to support my actual feelings and thoughts based on what I have in the past written. So that's interesting. Number 4, does my language unnecessarily medicalize autism when describing educational supports? That one I think is highly prevalent in our field. Number 5, does my language suggest to lay people that the goal of my research is to behavioral control and normalization rather than granting as much autonomy and agency to autistic people as reasonably possible? So am I looking to fix things? If I am, I should rethink my research and how I'm talking about it. Number 6, am I using particular words or phrases solely because it is a tradition in my field, even though autistic people have expressed that such language can be stigmatizing? Boom, we know we're all doing that in various ways. And number 7, does my language unnecessarily other autistic people by suggesting that characteristics of autism bear no relationships to characteristics of non-autistic people? So these are really great questions, and I sat with them hard, and I think that it's something that you could sit with, I think. And I learned a lot about myself and where I need to do better.
Some more community participatory research.
Right. So then they move forward.
Check yourself.
And they give some suggestions, which I think are super helpful in table 1 on page 3. And they say, okay, here are some things that we all can do to change our language around how we talk about autistic people or people with autism. So that's one of the ways. Like, one of the concerns is that there isn't consistency or accuracy when you say people with autism or autistic people. And they don't really give an answer. They just like ask your audience, which is an answer, right? But one thing that I've noticed researchers doing in our field, which I appreciate, is using both. So switching back and forth if you don't know who your audience is, right? So I think I like that. I found that, that helps hit everyone, makes it more inclusive. So something else that they said, okay, maybe stop using patronizing language such as special interests, right? So maybe you say areas of expertise or focus interest or passionate interest instead of special. Remember using that word special as denoting as something othered. We all have focus interest, right? And so making it more normalizing that, I think, is what they're looking for. Again, they said special needs. Maybe talk about the description of the specific needs. So maybe special education now could be specific supports, right? Instead of special education.
We call it targeted education.
Oh, I love that. That's great. Yeah. And everyone can participate, right? Not just someone on an IEP, but everyone can participate in some sort of targeted education wherever they need it. Wouldn't that be great?
And then it would be less about like, if you can't do this the way the teacher taught, would you just need, some more targeted instructions or targeted education observed? That's fine. Everyone learns different skills, different ways.
Boom.
And, I mean, again, not to discount that people have a disability. And
right, absolutely. No, but everyone
this is a part of learning. Everyone will learn differently.
Right, and then that normalizes getting, that normalizes and stops othering when people need more.
Realize, we tell everyone that all the time, all the students, everyone learns things differently. But not everyone gets called a special education student. So what's the message we're actually sending to the students of like, everyone learns differently unless you go out of the room to the special teacher, in which case you're really different from everybody else. Are we really signaling what we want to teach to students?
No,
that everyone has value?
Right, no.
And can find challenges and can overcome challenges?
Right.
Maybe we're making up challenges that don't need to be challenges because some of what we're teaching is pointless.
You're feeling it right now. Rob's feeling it right now. He's fallen down the hole that I fell down earlier. They say, instead of talking about challenging behavior, talk about the specific behavior that's happening, right? Instead of problem behavior, just talk about the specific behavior and define that one.
I tried to do that one the week after I read all these articles, and which was hard because I was trying to teach from a curriculum for de-escalation of challenging behavior. So I kept changing it every time I saw it. I was like, I don't like this term.
Right. So
my class really appreciated that.
Yeah, that's one I think that
can change.
I mean, that's a hard one because it is very ingrained, right? I try to say behavior targeted for decrease.
Yeah.
But
it's hard.
It's a tricky one.
Yeah. So
luckily, behavior can change.
Behavior can change. That's so great, right? And we all have behaviors that need to be increased or decreased. Instead of saying at risk for autism, say increased likelihood of autism. So it takes away that like nuance, like this is a bad thing to have.
Yep.
And talking about suffering from autism, I've read that so many, to just say the impact or effect of autism, right? Autism symptoms, instead of saying that, say specific characteristics or traits that the person is having. Instead of using the word treatment, which I never thought of before, and I'm not sure why.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of using treatment, say, here are the specific support service or educational strategies that we're using.
Yeah.
Instead of saying treatment.
Right.
Ooh, it's changing.
Which is tough. I mean, we have a whole section on our website called treatment.
So we need to change that. Yeah. Boom, we need to change it. And
It's
so
absolutely pervasive in our field.
it is.
Yeah.
Yep. And so I'm gonna take some of these off because I think, they wouldn't be necessary for school. But one thing I think is autism as a puzzle. No one loves that. So thinking about it as a part of neurodiversity. And
Or in case people haven't heard that, it is a criticism
Yes.
that's brought up because it implies that something is quote unquote missing from the person and that needs to be fixed. So it goes right back into that medical model. So
Parents in the 2000s really loved it.
they did
they
love it.
did. But a lot of autistic individuals prefer the infinity symbol instead.
Okay, and then the final one that I think would be helpful for school is instead of saying autism as an epidemic and saying autism as increasingly recognized or diagnosed. So being more specific about it instead of calling it like it's COVID, right? Like that's kind of what it sounds
has
like
a bad
on that.
connotation.
Yeah. So I just love that they talk about how you giving specific examples of how you can change the way you talk about it to be more anti-ableist. And then maybe with the change in language, we might see a change in behavior as well.
Well, let's come back around and enter the dissemination station. And I think, Dinah, I think we've all had a lot of opportunities for our own personal reflections. Why don't we wrap up with a return to story and looking at many
Sounds like
of
a
the
story.
recommendations. I know many of the recommendations about combating ableism and that are mentioned in the article, as well as certainly any that you feel could be added since 2007 when this was originally written.
Yeah, and this article written by Story is not specific to the population that we typically work with. So a lot of their recommendations are more, wide-ranging, perhaps related to folks with physical disabilities, etc. So I do think, part of this episode would be an exercise for our listeners to think about what might be ableist practices that they could see in schools that are more specific to an autism population, right? And when I hear that comes up a lot, as an example, is the expectation that you need to be sitting down and quietly listening in order to learn. That is kind of the norm in an educational setting. That is perhaps the way that a neurotypical person may learn best. But what we know from what autistic people have told us who can tell us is that they may learn better when they are moving around, when they have the opportunity to engage with fidget toys, when they are perhaps looking away from the person who's talking, etc. So some of these things that are like classroom rules or expectations could really hinder that person's learning rather than helping it. So the expectation that everyone's got to sit on the floor, crisscross applesauce with their hands in their lap looking at the teacher could be an ableist expectation for someone whose neurotype is different and could learn in a different way. So that's just one example. Do y'all have any that you want to add?
I think certainly looking at kind of bias in a lot of the content, curriculum and school activities necessarily. And then there's been a really nice move towards more kind of unified activities that are sort of built around the idea of creating environments where individuals can kind of work together that are really taking in mind the concern that, well, if you just have a bunch of buddy groups, there's a chance that your non-disabled peers just take over. And it's like, isn't it nice that you're here, buddy? Like, the people with disability get to be the sidekick to the other individuals' activities. So I think there's a real thought as to how to avoid that while still making sure that there's a high level of inclusion and meaningful inclusion. But also just thinking about biases in terms of so much of the content in published curriculum when they celebrate people with disabilities, it's very much like, here's the sidebar about how they overcame their disability, like they cured themselves. Or even though they had a disability, they managed to do just as good as someone without a disability. Like, what an exception to the normal disability narrative where they weren't able to do that. And how can we include that more? And some of it could just be, thinking about disability as, what does that mean to have a disability, and what is, what are the positives of an individual as a human being who has a disability, as well as, stories. So just making sure everything's not about, here's the story and it's got to be some sort of inspiring story. It could just, people living lives and finding joy in their life would be, I think, a very fascinating story. Not everyone has to be on the sidebar of your science textbook to have a meaning. And if you do make the sidebar, well, there's a chance that it's some sort of discriminatory reason that they're only in the sidebar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that can be the case a lot for anyone who's part of any minority group.
Yeah,
they end up having
more
to be
universal discrimination. Yeah.
the representative for that group within whatever setting that they're in, and that is undue pressure and another form of discrimination as well. Cool, good. Jackie, you have anything you want to add?
No, I'm really hitting home on this language concept and how we use the language and talk about people on their IEPs and on their 504s and how we can make it more strength-based approach while still providing the supports that students need.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. And that ties into another thing I think can happen a lot in schools is that we talk about people in front of them, right? As though they're not there. And that gets tied into, I know we've talked about it in the past in the Donaldson et al. Article from 2017. I think we talked about it in episode 1. I wrote it down. Episode 251, I think. No, I think episode 268 is when we talked about it. Because I just love that article, and it talks about a strength-based approach and how we should incorporate that into neurodiversity perspectives. And they, in that article, talk about presuming competence, right? And that's one key piece of it, is not talking about someone in front of them as though they're not standing there, right? So if you were with someone with a disability, don't talk to their support worker, talk to them. It's just respectful. And that may be something, perhaps if you are working in a school setting, that you see, because it is quite pervasive, I think. So there's a second example of that, and listeners at home may think of other things too. To circle back around to Story, he talks about ways that we can potentially combat ableism in schools, and these are certainly places to start. So just really briefly, he says we should be working on ability awareness. So making sure that we talk about disability. It's like part of the conversations that we're having. Again, it's not a bad thing. Everyone is different. People are coming in with differences. And as my own aside, it's okay too that someone needs more support in certain areas. So it's not like, oh, everyone's different, but we're all the same, right? Like that's patronizing as well. It's okay to say this person needs extra help in this area. It doesn't make them less. It's okay that they are different in that way. We still like them as a person, right? And they are still equal as a person. You're, like Rob said, your value should not be based in your contributions to society. So then he talks about that. He talks about like something I'm not sure on, which is doing simulated activities regarding what it's like to have a disability.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like that could go very wrong very fast.
What you can notice, I did write in all caps right after.
I know.
That
I see that all caps again.
So other fields do this in terms of like they have like the day. I know like some undergraduates. I can't remember if I think they might be in therapeutic recreation where they have to spend the whole day in a wheelchair.
Yes, I have heard of that.
So those types of things, I think.
Okay.
But I'm not sure how. I mean, I think
it would bring a very important perspective,
yes.
right? So you can imagine how that would change your perspective once you've done it. I just think you have to plan ahead so that you do a good job of this, because I think it could go really wrong.
It's an empathy building activity regardless, but I think unlike where it was originally, I think it was like that blue eye, brown eye sort of teacher game or activity. Everyone sees, well, that's not equitable, that's not fair. And when you're talking about more like discrimination based on race or ethnicity, I think it does build an empathy and then actionable steps. Whereas, I agree, Dana, I would worry that this would start
I would never
that
want
way.
to be like, pretend you have an intellectual disability.
Yeah.
That's not cool.
But I think it could also like build an empathy, but not necessarily lead to sort of the actionable steps that you could take to change that, because so much of where I see ableism coming in is just this sort of standardization of normal versus disabled, which I don't know if this activity necessarily would get at.
Normal's not a great word.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm
either, right?
Well, in terms of the articles we read, the terms used normal versus disabled in terms of how disabilities are diagnosed. Not that I think there is a normal or a disabled. Well, there are disabled, but how there's like some magic normal. I'm just using the terminology.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So maybe it could be done well. And next, he talks about disability content and curriculum and school activities. We want to have opportunities to think about that there are common humanity across everyone, regardless of different groups you may exist in. I think I kind of touched on that on my own little soapbox there for a second. And Rob, you already touched on another point that they had here, that it's important that there are integration opportunities, but you also risk, like you said, the non-disabled peer taking over or being like, swooping in as the hero and helping the disabled peer experience something. And that
your
creates
job
that.
here is to help this person rather than your job here is to
get to know this person
together or to do something together.
Yeah, you guys are a team. Yeah. So the approach there has to be done carefully and correctly. And a lot of that has to do with how the teachers are introducing it, what their understanding of disability is and potential ableism pitfalls maybe, and how they're educating the students about disabilities as well, which ties into the next one. He recommends teacher in service. Everyone needs to get more training. We don't disagree on that one, right?
Nope.
He talks about having disability literature available in the classroom and using positive role models of individuals with disabilities. Absolutely. Let's do more of that. He also talks about hiring teachers with disabilities too. Nothing is as meaningful for students than seeing someone like themselves in a role that they aspire to. It just can't be replaced, right? So how wonderful that we could potentially think ahead and plan for that type of opportunity as well.
One thing, just going back to the in-service then.
Oh, sure.
The story mentions is also as part of that in-service, making sure that the speakers and the trainers are individuals who have disabilities when possible versus just, I'm the head of the special education department, I'm going to tell you about this disability. So that it comes off as hearing about someone's lived experiences and how our actions can support or really tear down certain individuals with disabilities versus just here is a list of things you should know about disability A, disability B, disability C.
Yeah, I think another thing you want to think about there too is maybe do as a combined effort so that you're not placing all of the load on the person with whatever is different in that way. So that could be something.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of work that one can do on their own to educate themselves and not rely on a person who's already, potentially marginalized by society to engage in further emotional effort.
Will you be hiring someone whose job, who says,
them.
my job is, no, I'm not just saying like find someone with a disability and make them be your special speaker. Like find someone who says, my job is I like to talk about my experience. I'm a trainer in this area.
I like that idea. That's good stuff. Okay. And then they end with saying just giving people skills and education isn't enough. It could allow them to continue to ignore ableism that exists within these settings. We need to, really make concerted effort towards identifying this, allowing people to sit with it and move through it so that they can then become, like you guys have said, anti-ableism advocates and allies.
Whew, good one, everyone. Really good discussions today.
Great job ourselves.
Let's move on into pairings, shall we?
Okay, yay. It's time for pairings. In pairings, I tell you about past episodes you might want to check out if you found this topic of interest. So we have several several episodes you could go back and listen to if you liked this one. Here they are in no particular order. Episode 165, Quality of Life. Episode 160, Incorporating Unique Interests with Tamika Meadows. Episode 251, Self-Determination in IEP Planning. Episode 236, Assent and Self-Determination with Alex Kishbaugh and Dr. Haley Steinhauser. Episodes 268, 280, and 281, which was our recent neurodiversity series we did with a variety of guests as well, actually. And then episode 1001, the 1000 numbers are just book club episodes. So that's the two-parter.
It always gets me too. I'm like, what?
And not all the book clubs, because we didn't think about that naming convention until we'd done a bunch of them already.
That's true. But this one is a 2-hour episode on the Neurotribes book that you could go back and listen to. And then for pairings, I also like to recommend a snack to go with it. So the snack today, I'll tell you what it is, and you can tell me why I chose it. Square pizza, corn, and a carton of chocolate milk.
Because that's what everybody gets at lunch when you're in elementary school.
That's right. It's school lunch. Hooray.
Gotcha.
That's Mondays for Shrewsbury.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Pairings, please enjoy.
All right. Well, thanks to everybody for joining us in the conversation. Thanks to all you listeners out there. If you like ABA Inside Track, please subscribe to the show. You can also find us on a lot of places online where you can engage with conversations about episodes and what's not. We're online as ABA Inside Track on the socials, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all the articles we discussed in this episode, as well as our back catalog. You can also subscribe to get even more ABA Inside Track content on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for $5 a month, you're able to access all of our episodes a week ahead of time, as well as access special videos of our quarterly listener choice episodes and get access to a chance to vote on those episodes. We actually have our winter polls coming out very, very soon. And if you want to hear things like those Neurotribes type book clubs ahead of everybody else, as well as get free CEs for the listening, you can subscribe at our $10 premium level, where you can just hear our most recent book club. It should be coming out around the time of this episode, on the science of consequences, as well as all of our previous book clubs. And again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. And finally, if CEs are your thing, you probably want our second secret code word. It is hot dogs. HOTDOGS. There's a space in between. I mean, put it in or don't put it in. Hot dogs. It's a delicious treat for some people. Not everyone likes hot dogs. I like hot dogs.
I don't.
With stuff on them. I like to go to Spike's Hot Dogs down in Rhode Island. Get curly fries and a hot dog. Now I just want to go there for dinner. That's where we're going, Diana. Quick, get in the car. We're going to get hot dogs in Providence. Hot dogs. All right. And then some final thanks. Big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.